Daniel and Ashley, and all the family and friends of Daniel and Ashley. What a pleasure it is, what an honor it is for me to participate in this wonderful event and to pay tribute to Ashley and to Daniel, whom I've come to know very well and to become very fond of in the last few years. And I'm particularly gratified that they asked me to deliver a homily at their wedding. I'm very pleased to know that, to have that distinction. Grateful to the couple for requesting that I fill this role. At least at first I was pleased about that. And then as the time approached, I began to wonder, just what is a homily? What have they gotten me into here? You know, I've been a professor for many years, and I've given probably hundreds of talks in classes, in conferences in this country and abroad. I've spoken at commencements, I've spoken at alumni gatherings, I've spoken at associations of retired persons, I've spoken at museums and at memorials, I've spoken at synagogues, I've spoken at the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club, the Town and Gown Club. I even spoke at a luxurious European spa and resort. But a homily? You know, when I think of homilies, I think of the learned homilies with commentaries on the sacred scriptures by John Chrysostom. First springs to mind, the Archbishop of Constantinople in the 4th century. And these, of course, were erudite and eloquent tracts filled with theology, filled with exegesis. That's a pretty intimidating model to look upon. Well, surely Ashley and Daniel did not have John Chrysostom in mind when they picked me. They knew they were not going to get theology from an ardent secularist. So I've chosen instead to speak to the occasion, speak to the individuals who are being wed, without giving them a ponderous presentation, and perhaps with a bit of a light touch here and there. Now, Ashley and Daniel, because of the people who they are, have actually made my task relatively easy. First of all, they are both students and budding scholars of texts drawn from ancient Judaism and early Christianity, texts with which I have some small familiarity, at least, which allows me to select a few relevant passages for commentary. So I'll give a kind of homily-like character to the proceedings. But more important, these two charming people have had a relationship that was both joyous and fulfilling on the one hand, but also quite challenging on the other. They came from different backgrounds, different personalities, different ideologies, which required a considerable strength of will and of tolerance and of unstinting mutual support and a love that permitted them to overcome those challenges. So that gave me some ideas. what texts would be relevant and appropriate for this couple and for this occasion? What texts would illustrate their qualities, provide some useful models, and yet not be terribly solemn and not overly serious? Well, I begin with a passage from the letter to the Colossians. This is a work long attributed to Paul, but scholars now are fairly unanimous that it was not written by Paul. That's the only pedantic element I'm going to introduce here. The author, writing to the fledgling Christian community in Colossae in Asia Minor, he urged upon them the qualities of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And then he added something else, which in my view is absolutely vital for a successful marriage, namely forgiveness. What better prescription can one have for a successful marriage than that? The author of Colossians had it just right. And it reminds me of an old joke in which a married couple, married for many years, every morning when the husband wakes up, turns to his wife and he says, "I want to ask you for forgiveness in advance for all the dumb things I'm going to do all day long." And that points up the importance of acknowledging one another's failings, of addressing them, and of forgiving them. Now, in considering what weddings I might draw on from the text that would be familiar to the young couple and would be appropriate to their studies, would be relevant to the occasion, I've come up with three. One from the Hebrew Bible, and two from outside the canon, but included in the Apocrypha, the kinds of texts that Ashley in particular has been very familiar with in the wonderful work she did in obtaining her PhD last year. First, from the Book of Ruth. Now, everybody knows the famous lines. They've already been read here tonight, quite appropriately. So the words that Ruth, the Moabite Ruth, utters to her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi: "Whither you go, I will go. Where you stay, I stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God." Or it could mean your gods, my gods, but I won't get pedantic about that either. Everyone is familiar with that, but less familiar is what takes place later in the narrative, namely a wedding. Ruth had met the kindly and generous Boaz, who allowed, indeed encouraged her to glean among his fields and to bring grain back to the struggling mother-in-law, Naomi. And Naomi was delighted to learn of this. She happened to be a relative of Boaz, and she urged Ruth to get closer to Boaz, see him more often, get to know him well, which Ruth did. And one day, on Naomi's urging, Ruth dolled herself up and went to the threshing floor where Boaz lay asleep, having had a hard day's work in the fields. There she crept in, and it appears indulged in a bit of hanky-panky. Now, the text says only that Ruth lay down next to Boaz and uncovered his feet. Now, some scholars have interpreted feet as another part of Boaz's anatomy, but I don't want to pursue that point, at least not in the august surroundings of the Grace Cathedral. In any case, the episode eventually led to the marriage of the impoverished Ruth to the very wealthy Boaz, Boaz who could trace his ancestry back to Judah, the son of Jacob. So we have a kind of Cinderella story here. And the union subsequently produced a child whose genealogy not only reached back to the Hebrew patriarchs, but reached ahead to King David, and eventually, indeed, to Jesus. So the wedding united persons of different backgrounds, of different ethnicities in this story, and of different social standing, a number of differences. But love conquered all. And of course, they lived happily ever after. The two had overcome obstacles with a blend of gentleness, of compassion, and of mutual attraction. Now, that isn't the lesson that we most commonly get from the book of Ruth, but it is indeed a central one to that story, and it is one most pertinent for a couple who faced their own difficulties, but who had the qualities enshrined in this narrative to grapple successfully with those problems. Next wedding, from the Book of Tobit. Now, it's a long and involved tale with the wedding as its culmination. I'm going to skip most of the story and get right to the marriage of Tobias and Sarah. It took a great deal of courage and of perseverance on the part of the couple. Because Sarah, you see, had had 7 previous marriages, all of which ended on the wedding night. Sarah was tormented by a demon who snuffed out the lives of each of the bridegrooms before they could reach the marriage bed itself. And by the time Tobias came around to woo Sarah, Sarah's father had pretty much given up all hope. He was going to suffer the same fate as anybody else, and he even dug a grave so that he could slip Tobias in there under cover of night, and the neighbors wouldn't notice that anything had happened during the day. Now, it turned out that these precautions proved to be unnecessary, because this time, Tobias had brought with him a powerful potion, and the demon took one sniff of this potion, which turned his stomach, and he fled immediately all the way to Egypt. So the couple had an undisturbed and blissful night. Now the father, of course, had to scramble to fill in this grave that he had just dug up a few hours before, so that the nosy neighbors wouldn't wonder what had happened this time. But the marriage took place. It brought happiness and joy all around. So Tobias's perseverance, Sarah's determination carried the day. They were unwilling to fail. And that is an important recipe for a successful marriage. Be unwilling to fail. Now, the third and last story also comes from Hellenistic Jewish writings. It is an expansion on the Joseph story, which we get in the book of Genesis. But in this version, it is a kind of novel called Joseph and Aseneth. And in this version, Joseph does not have to fend off Potiphar's wife, who wanted to bed him, if not to wed him. And instead, he meets the ravishing beauty Aseneth, who is the daughter of the Pharaoh's minister. Now, the two seemed at first completely incompatible, because the uptight Joseph would have nothing to do with any Egyptian woman who worshipped idols and who did not recognize the true divinity. And Aseneth, who was a committed virgin, would have nothing to do with any man at all, let alone a Hebrew who had been a shepherd and would come to Egypt as a slave. Out of the question. But again, the wonders of love took over. Aseneth took one look at the dazzlingly handsome Joseph, cast off all of her inhibitions, and fell hopelessly in love. Joseph, for his part, once Aseneth had smashed all of her idols, asked for forgiveness, embraced his way of life, Joseph shed all of his previous reluctance and entered very enthusiastically into marriage. It didn't hurt that both of them had Hollywood-type looks. So this wedding story obviously points up the importance of a willingness to compromise, the ability of each to accommodate the other, and of course the power of physical attraction. Now, knowing Ashley and Daniel as I do, it's easy to see how these wedding tales underscore the qualities that characterize their own relationship. Each of the narratives alludes to struggles and to obstacles that needed to be overcome. This was not all sweetness and light. And Ashley and Daniel have regularly displayed the kind of caliber that is required to succeed. That whatever problem either of them encountered, the consistent support and encouragement of the other proved to prevail. They demonstrate the compassion and the generosity that's exemplified by the story of Ruth and Boaz, the determination and the fortitude that is exhibited in the Book of Tobit, and the ability to modify behavior and modify commitments, as is exemplified by the story of Joseph and Aseneth. Not to mention what is obviously transparent to all, their engaging attractiveness. Now, the great respect and love they have for one another, the marvelous comfort that they've always felt in one another's company, and the shared cultural and intellectual interests, and not least, to come full circle in this, their willingness to forgive. What more could one ask? As in each of the stories that I've recounted, this couple too will live happily ever after.